You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports, powered by Overtime Media. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, and with me, as always, is my partner in crime, who you all know and love as your Denver Broncos reporter for 24/7 Sports. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, obviously an avalanche of news, an avalanche and a flurry of activity finally on Wednesday with the Broncos on the doorstep of training camp holding their annual media barbecue. But before we get to all that, we found out that they're one less wide receiver in competition for a roster spot. Aaron Burbridge hung up his cleats.
Yeah, this was kind of surprising considering it's on the doorstep of training camp. And let me just say, Chad, you hit on the key word there, which was finally we have real Broncos news. Finally, we have stuff to talk about. It's been nice after 6 weeks of relative inactivity. But yeah, Aaron Burbridge, he's a fourth-year guy. He had 3 seasons, but he's been injured through most of his brief career. He was a pick of the Niners back in 2016. He knew, obviously, Rich Scangarello. He was assigned to a reserve futures contract in January, and he's stuck on the roster, but decided he's going a different direction with his life, I guess.
Yeah, he probably recognized how long his odds were, especially on this depth chart. I mean, if the Broncos have an embarrassment of riches in terms of going position by position, wide receivers got to be at the top, at least one of the deepest groups that the Broncos have. So, probably the best case scenario for him this year would have been a practice squad spot, which is $100,000. If you're on the practice squad, you're making $100,000. And if by chance someone gets hurt ahead of you on the depth chart, you're one injury possibly away from getting called up and getting those big game checks for actually being on an NFL roster. So I don't know, maybe that was it. Maybe there was something going on in his personal life. But as far as how it affects the Broncos, it doesn't.
Not in the least. I mean, the Broncos' backups have backups right now, but behind Emmanuel Sanders, Sutton, and Deshaun Hamilton are Tim Patrick, Juwan Winfrey, and River Craycraft. Those are all good receivers. So, yeah, he definitely had no shot. Even at a practice squad spot, the Broncos have good competition there. He's only 25, though, so that would lead me to believe that he's just tired of maybe being injured, tired of the grind of the NFL. Maybe he has another job lined up. The fact that he retired and not just maybe asked for his release says to me that he's pretty sure of what he wants to do.
Yep. Well, hey, we do have a ton to get to today, and then, of course, we'll be back again tomorrow for the Mailbag Friday. But first, just a couple quick reminders. You guys make sure you are following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod, because that's how you can keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the show in real time. If you're on iTunes, we appreciate you leave us a creative review. And if you like what you hear, a 5-star rating. And YouTube, keep commenting, keep sharing, keep liking, subscribing. We just put a thread out on YouTube in our community tab on the channel for questions if you want to get some in for Friday's mailbag. So our YouTube listeners, check that out. And anyone else, VIPs, you know what to do. MHH Insiders Forum, post your questions there. And if you're on Twitter, we'll take some questions from Twitter too. Just hit us up at HuddleUpPod. All right, Zach, let's dive in. First thing that I think was eating at fans when they woke up Wednesday morning was Drew Lock and what was going to happen there. And it was covered somewhat by the excitement of the media barbecue and getting to hear from John Elway, Vic Fangio, Von Miller, Chris Harris. We'll get to all that, but one of the things that came not too much longer after that was Drew Lock got signed. He's done. He's in the fold. Technically, it was never a holdout because he will be there in time to start training camp day one.
Yeah, I wasn't worried at all. We even talked about it, Chad, a couple podcasts ago, that he should be in camp on time. There should be no extended holdout. I was never worried. I'm not worried about the ramification of this. The only thing is, it's not the best look for him to draw this kind of attention to himself when he's already being asked to develop fairly quickly. He has the potential face of the franchise burden on his shoulders. He has a lot of responsibility. He's not even going to be the backup going into the Hall of Fame game. He has to work for that. So to ask for a little more money up front and knowing, or his agent knowing how John Elway traditionally is, I don't think it was the smartest career move he could have made. But long-term and short-term, it had no ill effect on the Broncos operation.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that as a young quarterback who experienced a little bit of a plummet on draft day, that hurts your stock a little bit, probably the best approach would have been to just accept your slotted contract as the 42nd overall pick and show up ready for work. Now, what I understand, what I've been told, is this whole QB premium bone that his camp picked with the Broncos, that was coming from his agent. And a lot of these players, they just basically listen to the agent who tells them that, look, I've been doing this for a long time. I've done it before. Here's what we need to do. They understand the nuance. They understand the legalities of the league, the expectations, how contracts work, how the cap works, how negotiations work. And so they're often, especially young players just entering the league, they listen to what their agent says. They just fall into line. And so I wouldn't hold it against Drew Lock at this point that he was hoping for that QB premium. Chalk it up to just a young guy getting led by his agent who, hey, I think you know what's best. You've been doing this a long time. So I do wonder a little bit, though, Zach, if it might, even though it's not a holdout, but it created some headlines, right? Mm-hmm. I wonder how much it might affect his standing in the locker room. I'm sure he'll get razzed a little bit over it.
I wouldn't hold it against him, but look what Dalton Reisner did on Tuesday. He went to his agent and demanded he step up because he did not want to miss any sort of part of training camp, either the medical check-ins or the team meetings. So Law could have done that. He's still getting $7 million. He's still got a $3 million signing bonus. It's not chump change. So to squeeze a little more, a couple $100,000 out of the Broncos and to draw that negative attention to him, maybe he was mad about not getting the fifth-year option. Maybe he thought he would be a first-round pick and he lost out on that. I don't know what his motivation was, but he already had an uphill battle to climb on this depth chart to get a backup. And to draw that attention to yourself for a negligible gain, I kind of question that, even though I'm not holding it against him. I think it'll be okay.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. If I'm a player, I wouldn't want that. That'd be one of the silver linings, in my opinion, of going from round 1 to 2 is they can't put that fifth-year option on me. That means that when I get to my fourth season, they're either going to have to pay me or franchise tag me, where the real money comes in because, that fifth-year option, I know that was one thing that the league owners pushed for on the rookie contract side that the players' union initially really tried to resist and barter against in negotiations, but they eventually caved because they want the veterans to have as much ability and freedom to negotiate openly as soon as they possibly can, because it's for the players' union and for the players, of course, it's all about security and making as much money as possible. And that fifth-year option, it really favors teams more, I think, than it does players.
I mean, if money is his motivation, and Chad, I'm just guessing. Admittedly, I'm just guessing here, but if he wants the money, I mean, you still get a lot of money on a quarterback franchise tag, and it's all immaterial because if he pans out, if he's the Broncos franchise quarterback, they'll rip up his deal in a couple years anyway, and they'll have to pay him before he gets to the market. So long term, it really doesn't matter, and we'll all forget about this a couple months from now. I don't really see his motive here. I don't understand it completely.
Speaking of quarterbacks, John Elway talked a few times about Joe Flacco on Wednesday, and one of the topics that came up was the similarities, right, in the Peyton Manning arriving in Denver as a 14-year veteran with a Super Bowl ring in 2012, and Joe Flacco arriving in Denver in 2019 as a Super Bowl champion. There's a lot of similarities later in their careers, trying to go out in a blaze of glory, basically, and John Elway was asked whether or not he had talked to Joe Flacco about, hey, you want to try and basically follow the blueprint laid out by Peyton Manning. And Elway said that, at least publicly, he hasn't talked to Joe Flacco about Peyton Manning, but do you think that's true?
It could definitely be, and Elway is genuinely all in on Joe Flacco. He believes that this is the best quarterback situation they've been in since Peyton hung up his cleats. They believe he has a guy who's entering his prime right now at 34 years old. The best football is still to come in Elway's eyes. And you have that long-term backup on the roster who you can take over preferably a year or 2 years from now whenever Flacco's done. So in Elway's eyes, I take what he says at face value. I believe he's genuinely supportive of Joe Flacco, and he sees a guy who can take him back to the playoffs and beyond. He's pushed all of his cards on the table when it comes to number 5.
I thought it was interesting how he said later on in that conversation that basically he wants Joe Flacco, he thinks he has a chance to, quote-unquote, finish it out right, meaning his career, punctuate it with a world championship and I guess ostensibly right off into the sunset like Elway himself did, and of course Peyton Manning. I thought it was interesting for him to lay that out on Front Street so, blatantly and publicly that that's putting some expectations. I mean, not that doesn't come with the territory, but you're really putting it, I think, up onto that next level. In fact, Elway said, quote, "I think Joe realizes the situation he's sitting in again with the reputation of this organization for a long period of time. I think Joe knows coming in here that he's going to have a chance to finish it out right." Close quote. And, of course, we know that Peyton Manning was 36 when he arrived in Denver. Flacco's got a couple years, he's only 34 only, but compared to Peyton Manning. So, I mean, I wrote about this on Wednesday, he could play for another half decade, Joe Flacco, the way the trend seems to be going. But that's only if he has success, because if he doesn't produce in Denver, he might find a backup job somewhere else in 2020. But if he really wants to be able to continue to push the envelope and compete, or continue to earn money, and really go out in the same way that Peyton Manning did, or have the option to go out in the same way that Tom Brady could right now if he wanted to, he's going to have to continue, or at least find a way to produce something we haven't really seen yet from Flacco.
Yeah, I don't know about closing out his career here. I think that's a little too optimistic, but what Elway's done is what he's done all offseason, and that's going out of his way to prove that Flacco is not, or to show that Flacco's not just a Band-Aid. He's not another Case Keenum. He's genuinely a guy who can be here for 2 years to 5 years to whatever, till he can hang up his cleats. I just think, though, before we see end it down of football with Joe Flacco, it's a little too homeristic to say he can hang up his cleats here, he can retire here. He has a lot to prove still. He has to prove he can be a starting caliber quarterback and get the Broncos back to respectability, let alone the postseason. But based on Elway's belief, and if we're going on that solely alone, then Flacco should expect to be here for at least the next couple of years.
I thought it was also interesting what Elway had to say when asked directly whether or not Garrett Bowles is under any added pressure. And then also questioning, what kind of an impact Mike Munchak might be able to have on Bowles. And basically, to paraphrase Elway, he said, well, look, first of all, everyone on this team is under pressure. It's a pressure game. We got to win, et cetera, et cetera. Then he went on to say, quote, "Garrett's in the same position as everybody's in. We've got to come in. We've got to play well. I think Mike Munchak will help him tremendously." How do you think Elway's viewing the Garrett Bowles situation right now?
I think he's trying to protect his first-round pick and not to show that he's a bust, and that's kind of his ego talk in there. Same reason and same logic he had with Paxton Lynch. Garrett Bowles is under, way more pressure than most other Broncos players. He was a first-rounder. He's supposed to be the blindside protector of the future, and he's been way too inconsistent. I guess Elway's chalking all that up to coaching the last couple of years and taking the blame off Bowles' shoulders, but to say that he's on the same playing field as everyone else is wrong. I mean, that guy has more to prove than most other people on this offense and this defense and the entire coaching staff included. So I think he's trying to protect a controversial pick at the time that he made. There's other players on the board he could have went with, and went with Garrett Bowles. So it hasn't worked out, and I think he's talking it into existence, Chad. His 2019 breakout party.
Yeah, and there's a lot that we could cover in terms of what Elway had to say. Most of it is really just recapitulating, remining storylines and topics that he's already talked about earlier in the offseason. But one thing I thought was interesting is he was asked directly, Elway, what his quote-unquote realistic expectations for the Broncos are this season. And I'm gonna read this quote real quick. He said, quote, "I'll let you guys set that as far as the expectations. We know what our goals are. The bottom line is I never went into a season saying we're going to be 10-6. I think we walk into every game with the idea that we can win it. The bottom line is we've got to go out and execute and play well. Obviously, you've got to get a little bit lucky and stay healthy, but our expectations are to take it a day at a time, get through preseason, see what we have, and then look forward to the opener in Oakland. Really take it, Zach, 1 week at a time, because he goes on to say there's a lot of unknowns. It's a new staff, a lot of new players, but he's hopeful to have a good year," close quote, to paraphrase him also towards the end there. But he doesn't want to go out on a limb, and no GM in the NFL is going to make any kind of bold prediction for a record, so it's not that we expected that from Elway, but I think he's trying to walk that line of being optimistic, because you got to be. I mean, that's part of your job as a leader of a team, even at a executive level, is to have the vision and the optimism and the expectations for success. But at the same time, he's trying to temper that. Look, we got a new staff, a lot of new players. We're going one game at a time.
See, this answer I really liked a lot because it was way more honest and heartfelt and genuine. He looked the Broncos in the mirror, and what he saw was a team that still has a ways to go, even if they made monumental improvements on the coaching staff and the personnel. They are still a 6-10 team until proven otherwise, and he knows that they're not going to come into the season and just expect the postseason. If it happens, it happens. Great. And then the Broncos look like the better team. They look like the surprise team. And Elway looks like the genius for putting it all together. If they go 10-6, let's say. But if they go 5-11, 6-10, 7-9, then he can say, I never said anything. There's no bulletin board material out there. And that was smart on his behalf, too. He knows that, he's being counted out by a lot of places, and the Broncos are as well, even with all the magic he's done the last couple of years. And it happens on the field. So until he sees them in Oakland, is what he's saying, he's not going to put any record or any prediction on anything, which is smart.
One last thing we want to talk about that Elway had to say at the podium on Wednesday. We're going to get to that here in just a second. First, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, let's talk really quick about what Elway had to say news-wise about Emmanuel Sanders. He said basically that, no, we're not going to put him on the PUP. So he will not be placed on the physically unable to perform list to open the season, which tells me the full plan here, Zach, is for Emmanuel Sanders' availability week 1 to be a green light.
Yeah, that's been the goal, and that's the goal for Sanders and the Broncos medical staff, is to bring him along slowly. He'll practice from day one, John Elway said, but he's not going to be in team drills 11-on-11s. He's going to watch from the sideline and kind of give some reps to the younger players, but he's still going to be at practice at the facility, and if, barring any setbacks, on the field week 1 starting in Oakland. So that's the plan. I'm happy. It's only been 7 months, Chad, and that's still a very short period of time for a 32-year-old who suffered a devastating Achilles injury. So the fact that he's practicing at all and there's no limitation, no lists on his status for training camp, that's a great sign.
Definitely a great sign. And then after Elway vacated the podium, Vic Fangio sat down and made himself available. And one of the things that I think a lot of fans were happy to hear is regarding Phillip Lindsay. Fangio said, quote, "Lindsay's ready to go. Obviously, we'll ease him in. He didn't have the offseason work. All those guys are on different protocols as to how much we practice them to where they go just as much as anybody else, Jake. But Emmanuel, Lindsay will ease them in, but we'll get them in quickly," close quote. So, Zach, let me ask you, what do you think that means? We understand ease them in terms of kind of a pitch count on a rep count, etc. But when he says we'll get them in quickly, what do you think that means?
After the first few days of limited participation, I think they'll come out maybe with a padded session or maybe with shells, and they'll put them in there for some teamwork, just for a couple reps, maybe a series, just to see how they fare, and then take them out and don't risk further injury. It's going to be a slow process, and the Broncos have more training camp practices and they have more preseason games this year, so they kind of have to budget their reps differently. But by the end of the preseason, going into week 1, there should be no worries for any of those 3 players.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting how Fangio has kind of continued his skepticism, I guess, of Chris Harris a little bit publicly. Like he keeps talking about how he's behind the 8 ball because he missed so much time. And immediately following Fangio at the podium, Chris Harris stood up and he said that he was asked directly, well, Fangio thinks you're still a little bit behind and it might take you some time and this and that. What do you think? And Harris seemed to sound like, well, that's news to me. I think all I've been doing is studying the playbook all summer. I'm ready to rock.
Yeah, he met that question with such incredulousness. It was pretty crazy. He doesn't believe that he needed any extra time in the facility. He trained on his own in Texas, I believe. He kept his nose in the playbook, and he's a real confident guy, Chad. He's a real, I would say, borderline cocky guy, but he has the resume and the tape to back it up. I happen to agree with Vic Fangio, though. I mean, you still missed months of the Broncos' installation and being around your teammates and the chemistry building. That's important. It should catch up in training camp and in preseason, but he did miss some time. And the way he held out and the contentious state of affairs with money, I don't think that sat well with Vic Fangio at all. Someone who's completely no nonsense, no BS. For Harris to pull that, in a contract year, I think that rubbed Fangio the wrong way. So he's kind of giving it to him through the media.
I think that's true. I honestly do. We don't know that for a fact, but I think it did irritate him a little bit. And I'm not so sure that Fangio is even making a conscious effort to kind of downplay him a little bit in the media. I think it might be more Freudian slips than anything when he gets asked about Harris, that his first thing off the cuff is that he's behind the 8 ball. He needs to catch up. And we'll see. I don't think it'll take him long, in terms of whatever Fangio. I mean, he knows the process. He knows his scheme. He knows the installs. He knows basically where a guy needs to be about this time. So that answer should come for Fangio and Harris within the first day or two of camp, I would expect.
Yeah, but the thing is, the Broncos have such good leverage because they brought in so many different defensive backs this offseason where they're going to play them in different spots, and whoever's going to play the best is going to see the field. So Fangio has zero loyalty to Chris Harris Jr. and vice versa. He is Chris Harris as a mercenary for this team right now. I mean, he has no long-term loyalty beyond having a good season for them. So I believe Fangio is right. He has to be in the building. He has to keep his nose with his teammates and not do his thing on his own. But for such an old school, no nonsense guy, I just believe, and based on my just guessing, that did not, sit right in his first year when everyone else is in the building and you're holding out for more money. It just doesn't send a great message.
Harris had one of the best quotes, I think, though, of the day, changing the topic a little bit. He was asked whether, there's been some dark days in Denver the last couple of years, double-digit losses, first time losing season since the 70s, blah, blah, blah. He got hit with that at the podium. Is there extra motivation for this season? I want to read this quote. He said, quote, "I'm definitely motivated. I'm motivated every year. But I think this year I've got even more of a chip on my shoulder. I think the team should, as the underdog, the disrespect that we've had, we should have that chip. If you're not motivated going into this year, I don't know what type of football player you are. I don't know if I want to play with you. We need guys that are hungry, that want to get back to that level of standard that we have here, and it's going to take a lot of work, but I think we can do it," close quote.
That honestly sounds like a dig at someone. It's like he's personally talking to someone in the Broncos locker room. And I'm not trying to stir the pot, I promise you, but it was a little too on the nose for me. But the message is true. They've been disrespected by every single media outlet. Every analyst this offseason has been writing them off. So they are underdogs right now, and that's where they thrive. And Chris Harris has seen that. He's lived it. He's experienced it. He's been the top of the mountain with Denver, and he's been at the lowest valley with Denver. So he's right ultimately, but it was a very pointed message he was sending. I'm interested to see if that resonates with his teammates.
Me too. One last thing I want to touch on here from Chris Harris is he was asked about Will Parks, Justin Simmons, both of whom, as we've long known, are entering a contract year. And I thought it was interesting that he said, basically that going from the man coverage to playing zone is going to allow them to probably play a little bit more within their sphere of ability instead of following a guy, one-on-one all the time. You lose a lot of those matchups no matter how good you are. And if you aren't quite on the level yet as a young player, you lose a lot more than, some of the more experienced veterans do. And what he said is that the scheme's going to help those guys take the next step, but really they need to come into their own as a football player, which I thought was interesting because, we've talked a lot, especially about Justin Simmons taking that next step, but as an identity, that's really what we need to see happen from these guys is come into their own and kind of break the doors down and create that individual identity of, making themselves indispensable to this defense.
And then when they have that together, then the collective identity becomes a no-fly zone. And then you have that swagger back and that confidence. And that actually helps on the field. It produces results. The Broncos have been kicked in the gut the last couple years. The no-fly zone is no more, but they've been rebuilt. There's younger players in that secondary, versatile players, experienced players, Pro Bowlers. If they can put it all together, which I agree with, they have the makings of, again, a dominant unit. But the biggest thing that he was hitting on was coaching. They're going to put the players in a better position to succeed than what they saw under Vance Joseph. That's going to make the biggest difference of anything. Just exploiting their talent in a positive way, you're going to see the results come back, and you're going to see this Broncos secondary go back to ball hawking.
Yeah. Let's move on, and then we'll get out of here for today because we're going to have a big show tomorrow. But Vaughn, call me Kobe Miller. I liked what he had to say toward the end of his remarks when he was asked, hey, the Broncos didn't draft a true inside linebacker. What does that say, about Todd Davis and Josie Jewell? To quote Vaughn, he said, quote, "Todd Davis, he is the guy. Josie Jewell, he's the guy too. I've had confidence in those guys for quite a long while. Nobody works as hard as Todd Davis." And he goes on to say a few more other things too. But I think that really speaks to, you want to talk about a guy who's come into their own. Now, Todd Davis, he might not he might not yet have created that perception of being one of the best linebackers in the league or a superstar or anything like that, but he has come into his own. The last 2 years, especially last year where he was named a team captain for the first time, getting that second contract from the Denver Broncos, he has come into his own, and it's cool to see his teammates talk about his work ethic and, being the guy. As a former undrafted player out of Sacramento State, these guys' work ethic, that's what ends up making the biggest difference for him in the long run. Talked about Todd Davis in that sense, Josie Jewell. Vaughn seems to have the utmost confidence in his linebacker duo.
Listen, I love Von Miller, but Von Miller loves everyone. Everything is great to Von. Every player is great. He rarely has a criticism for anyone. He's such a good teammate that he goes above and beyond what's needed with hyperbole. So I'm going to take what he says with a grain of salt. Todd Davis is a great run stuffing inside linebacker, great off-ball linebacker in that sense, but he's not a good player in coverage. And Von is not being truthful he thinks he is. I mean, coaching should help, but every player has their limits. And pass coverage is his limit. Same with Josie Jewell. It still scares me personally. They should be formidable against the run, but opposing teams, scheme aside, will still target these inside linebackers in pass coverage. So Vaughn obviously knows more than I do. He plays next to them. He's in the locker room with them. But, to say he's the man, Todd Davis, in run stuffing, maybe, but in pass coverage as a 3-down linebacker, not so much.
I still think both those guys are going to take a step forward to heights heretofore unseen under Vic Fangio. That Fangio bump is going to benefit those guys. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be the second coming of Roquan Smith and Danny Trevathan in Chicago last year, but I think they're not going to be quote-unquote exposed as the weakness of this defense like a lot of people are thinking. That's one of my bold predictions for 2019 is that Todd Davis and Josie Jewell are going to impress a lot of people, health willing, if they can both stay healthy. But one last thing I want to touch on here from Von Miller, Zach, and then we'll get out of here, is I thought it was interesting and perhaps a little bit bizarre. He was asked about what it's like to not have really the proven depth of Shane Ray and Shaquille Barrett. That's gone. And he went to talk about Jeff Holland and Dakota Watson, of course, which are the only two really experienced guys. I guess Aaron Wallace has some experience with the Titans. But he said with regard to Dakota Watson that, quote, I don't think there's a guy in the league that has a get-off like Dakota, close quote. He's a special guy. That stunned me because he does have a get-off, but that kind of speaks to what you had to say about Vaughn, who just likes to shower his homeboys with, with the praise. Listen, as a teammate, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, and as a player, he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. But Von Miller thinks everything is incredible. Everything Broncos is incredible, and that's great for the fan and great for the reader, but not too realistic. Dakota Watson, there's a reason why he's been a journeyman, and he's on his second stint with Denver. He's an average player. Get off compared to who? Compared to a practice squad player? Maybe. Compared to a rookie? Maybe. But compared to him or Bradley Chubb or Khalil Mack, to say that is just so unrealistic, Chad. But it's great to hear that he has so much support for even the bottom of the roster type teammates. It kind of tells you what the pecking order is going to be. If Von Miller, when asked about depth, lands only on Jeff Holland and Dakota Watson, I think that kind of tells you where the team's heart is or where their plans are. Now that training camp and preseason, though, that's going to level the playing field. It's going to be every man for themselves behind Vaughn and behind Bradley Chubb. And by the way, he also threw a little bit of cold water on Holland and Watson's prospects, maybe not, inadvertently, by saying that he and Chubb want to play about 85 to 90% of snaps this year.
He wants that sack goal, man. I mean, he's been after that the last couple of years. He wanted 30, then now he wants 20. And if he plays that many snaps and Fangio's defense and all the stars align, he'll get it, and he wants it. And this duo, Chad, has the chance to be just record-setting. So I definitely appreciate that side of Vaughn, where he's honest enough to admit he wants to be on the field.
And I like, too, that when he was asked yet again the ubiquitous question about Fangio saying he can improve and all that, I loved how he said, look, I still have a lot to give. And to paraphrase him, a lot that I haven't accomplished. I haven't won Defensive Player of the Year one time. I haven't led the league in sacks one time. So for a guy like Vaughn, who really has to search in terms of trying to find those motivating achievements that he's yet to unlock, there are a couple of them out there. And to me, it's encouraging to see that he actually is viewing it that way. I don't think that's a front. I think he really does hear what Fangio's saying about improving the little details, how they can make a big difference. And if he can end up, using that as a platform to leverage himself up to that next level, becoming the Defensive Player of the Year, leading the league in sacks, man, he'll have accomplished it all in the NFL.
I think losing out to Khalil Mack a few years ago, that didn't sit right with him. And it's the only thing he hasn't accomplished. And in this defense, he has that chance to get to that mark. But Defensive Player of the Year, my bold take is it could be his teammate, Bradley Chubb. I just think he has that much potential in this defense, and Vic Fangio is so high on him. But I will say this about Von. I will give him credit. He's taken every criticism by Vic Fangio in stride this offseason. It's happened now 3 or 4 times on different occasions, and every time he's been, you know what, I agree, he's right, he's the coach. So that part of Von I do appreciate. And Vic Fangio, if he's the defensive mastermind, he thinks he can get you to a better level, then you got nothing to worry about.
Well, it was refreshing once again and exciting to have some topics to digest besides just really looking ahead and projecting. We had real conversations, real quotes to analyze, and tomorrow, we're recording this Wednesday evening so that you guys have it first thing Thursday morning. But Thursday, camp begins in earnest, and we're going to be back in the saddle Thursday night to record Friday's episode. So those of you who have questions, get them in. MHH Insiders Forum if you're a VIP. If you're on YouTube, you know where to go. Community tab on the channel. And then Twitter. If you're on Twitter, feel free to hit Zach and I up. Also on the @HuddleUpPod Twitter handle is probably the best way to do it. Make sure you're following that. And also, you can find Zach on Twitter @Kelberman247, myself @Chad and Jensen. So stay tuned. We'll be back in the saddle tomorrow. Until then, for Zach Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. Talk to you then.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.